You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult to...
The Windsor meeting was supposed to be private, tightly controlled, and almost painfully routine. Then Princess Charlotte looked toward the edge of the room and froze. One unfamiliar face had appeared among people who were meant to be cleared in advance. Before anyone could quietly explain it away, William noticed his daughter's expression, turned toward the stranger, and stopped the meeting with a single command. In seconds, protocol gave way to something far more personal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William felt the room change when Charlotte leaned toward him. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had noticed the tension in her daughter's face, while King Charles remained focused on the discussion. The Prince of Wales, the title held by the monarch's direct heir, did not wait for an explanation. He raised one hand, cut across the conversation, and ordered the meeting stopped. Charlotte had seen something the adults had missed, and William trusted her instinct immediately. Charlotte was not frightened because the man had threatened anyone. She was shaken because she had been told who would attend this restricted family and household discussion, and this face did not belong. Catherine moved closer as her daughter explained that she had seen the aide watching a corridor minutes earlier. William placed his palm on the table. "Nobody leaves this room," he said. Charles turned toward him, by his son's force, but did not challenge the order. Security officers approached the stranger and asked for identification. The badge he produced was real. That should have calmed the room, yet it did the opposite. The credential permitted palace access, but not entry into this meeting. William understood the danger. Windsor's internal controls used different levels of permission, meaning someone could enter the building legitimately without having the right to join a protected royal discussion. The stranger then named the senior household official who had supposedly told him to attend. William recognized the name instantly. That official had confirmed the attendance list earlier that morning. Charles watched his son's expression harden, while Catherine kept Charlotte close as officers requested the sheet. The household, meaning the staff structure managing the sovereign's official and private working life, now faced a contradiction that could not be dismissed as confusion. Then came the detail that changed everything. The unfamiliar aide's name was nowhere on the list, but one approved staff member's name had been crossed out minutes before the meeting began. William had stopped one meeting, but the crossed-out name suggested Charlotte had noticed only the visible part of a much deeper breach. For William, the crisis changed the instant he realized Charlotte had been the first person to detect it. Palace security could investigate badges, doors, and schedules. A father had a different problem. His daughter had entered a room believing every adult around her belonged there, and suddenly that confidence had been shaken. Across the table, Charles understood something equally uncomfortable. Windsor's security failure had unfolded in front of the next generation of the monarchy. William felt the weight of two duties colliding. As Prince of Wales, the title traditionally held by the heir to the throne, he was expected to project control, question the breach, and protect the institution. As Charlotte's father, he wanted something simpler, to make sure she did not leave Windsor believing she had become responsible for dangers adults had failed to catch. Charles carried another burden. Windsor represented continuity, discipline, and the idea that royal life could be controlled behind closed doors. Now that confidence had cracked. Charlotte turned to Catherine and asked the question that hurt most. Had she caused trouble by speaking up? Catherine answered immediately. No, she had done exactly the right thing. Yet the Princess of Wales could not hide how unsettled she felt that her daughter had been forced to judge whether an adult belonged in a protected room at all. William heard the exchange, and his expression softened before tightening again. William moved with Charlotte into a side room and lowered himself so they could speak at eye level. He asked her to describe the moment from the beginning. She explained that every other person had acknowledged the family entering, but the unfamiliar aide had looked away. Then she added something nobody had asked. She had first seen him near a corridor that did not lead directly to the meeting chamber. William said nothing for several seconds. Catherine suddenly remembered another detail. Shortly before the meeting, she had noticed a palace staff member closing a side door in a hurry. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it became part of a timeline nobody could ignore. Charles listened as the pieces were repeated, and the king's unease deepened, because the stranger might have been inside Windsor before he supposedly received permission to attend. William requested the entry logs from the previous 2 hours. The answer arrived quickly and changed the question entirely. One internal door had been opened with credentials assigned to someone who was not scheduled to be at Windsor that day. The mystery was no longer simply how an unfamiliar aide entered the meeting. It was why Windsor's own system appeared to recognize somebody who should never have been there. The strangest part of the Windsor breach was that it had not begun that afternoon. Days earlier, one small incident had already exposed a weakness inside the palace routine, but nobody understood its importance at the time. A forgotten access request, an uncomfortable exchange in a corridor, and William's unanswered question had all pointed toward the same danger. Only after Charlotte stopped looking at the unfamiliar aide and turned toward her father did those disconnected details suddenly form a pattern. William had already been uneasy about the constant staffing changes around private Windsor meetings. Members of the royal household were moving between engagements, so temporary substitutions had become more common than usual. The household, meaning the network of staff who manage the monarch's official and private duties, relied on those changes to keep schedules running. But the prince wanted fewer unfamiliar people near Catherine and the children, especially during restricted family discussions, where trust mattered as much as protocol. Charles had seen the problem differently. The king believed experienced officials could manage routine substitutions without treating every altered schedule like a security emergency. William thought that approach left too much room for assumption. Their disagreement never became an argument, but it created a quiet tension between father and son. Catherine understood her husband's concern, yet she also warned him not to let constant vigilance shape the children's sense of normal life. Now that Charlotte had been the one to notice the stranger, those words carried a painful new weight. William remembered the moment everything should have changed. 3 days before the stopped meeting, he had encountered an unfamiliar temporary aide outside a restricted Windsor corridor. When he asked whom the man was assisting, the answer came after a hesitation. The aide named a senior official, and William immediately requested a review of the substitution system that evening. The request was delayed until after the week's meetings. He had accepted that decision, but he had not forgotten it. William thought about the phone call again, as security officers rebuilt the timeline. He remembered setting the phone down after being told the review could wait. Then he looked directly at Charles and said, without anger, "I asked them to check this 3 days ago." The monarch did not respond immediately. Catherine watched the silence between them, knowing the sentence was not an accusation. It was something worse. Proof that a warning had existed before the breach. Security then delivered the detail that changed everything. The temporary aide William had challenged 3 days earlier did not match Charlotte's description of the man inside the meeting. They were two different people. One unauthorized face might have been confusion. Two separate appearances suggested a pattern, and William was now ready to confront the person responsible for controlling who entered Windsor. William did not summon a committee. He did not wait for another written explanation. He asked the senior household official named by the stranger to enter a private room at Windsor, then had the door closed behind them. Charles remained nearby, determined to hear the answer himself. What followed was not a ceremonial exchange between royals and staff. It was a direct confrontation over one question: who had given an unauthorized man permission to approach the family? William knew the official's position carried real weight. The man oversaw scheduling and staff movements connected to private meetings, which meant junior employees would rarely challenge an instruction linked to his name. That authority mattered because one false approval could move through the system almost unnoticed. Charles understood the same danger. The king also knew that an access failure did not automatically prove malicious intent, but after 2 unexplained appearances, simple confusion was no longer enough. William placed the attendance sheet on the table and pointed to the crossed-out name. "Did you authorize this change?" he asked. The official answered no. The prince did not raise his voice, yet the room tightened instantly. Charles watched his son closely, sensing how much anger William was holding back. The future king wanted facts before judgment, but he also wanted no more excuses hidden behind palace procedure. The official became visibly distressed when Charlotte's role was explained. He insisted he would never knowingly expose the princess to someone who had not been cleared. Then he described a short, internal message received earlier that morning. It requested a staffing substitution and used the correct meeting code. A meeting code, in simple terms, is an internal reference used to identify a specific restricted discussion without naming all its sensitive details. Because the wording looked authentic, he assumed another office had approved the change. Charles asked for the original message to be retrieved. William read it once, then again. The phrasing was almost perfect. The structure matched legitimate palace instructions, but the authorization did not come from the official's account. Someone had copied the style closely enough to survive a routine check. The official looked shaken now for a different reason. His authority had not merely been misunderstood, it had been imitated. Charles finally spoke, and one question silenced everyone. If the message was false, how did the sender know the private meeting code in the first place? William looked back at the official, and the answer was suddenly bigger than one crossed-out name. The confrontation had cleared one man of deliberately opening the door, but it raised a darker possibility. Whoever engineered the breach may already have understood Windsor from the inside. Palaces create an illusion of absolute control. Doors are guarded, names are checked, corridors are monitored, and every movement appears governed by protocol. Yet William now faced an uncomfortable truth. A security system is only as strong as the people authorized to change it. As investigators reconstructed the meeting, the prince discovered that responsibility for Windsor's internal access did not belong to one person. It passed through overlapping offices, and somewhere within those overlaps, accountability had disappeared. William began tracing the chain himself. Household scheduling controlled who was expected at private meetings. Protection officers controlled restricted zones, and senior staff could request temporary changes when duties shifted without warning. Protection officers, in simple terms, are the security personnel responsible for keeping royals and restricted areas safe. None of those layers looked broken on its own. That was exactly the problem. An amended staffing request, a genuine badge, and a door opened under valid credentials had combined into one failure. Charles sat alone with the preliminary security summary and read the same paragraph twice. Then the king lowered the pages and stared toward the closed meeting room door. His frustration was not about embarrassment. His granddaughter had noticed what an entire system had missed. William wanted immediate suspensions and a complete freeze on temporary access, but his father resisted that instinct. The monarch warned that punishing everyone before the facts were clear could destroy trust among innocent staff. William pushed back, because waiting now felt dangerous. He argued that caution had already been delayed once, and Charlotte had paid the emotional price by becoming the first person to question the stranger. Charles understood the anger, but he insisted that discipline had to be precise. Their disagreement became more than security policy. It exposed two instincts: the future king's urge to close every gap immediately, and the sovereign's determination not to confuse speed with justice. Investigators then narrowed the circle. Only a small group had possessed the private meeting code before the false instruction was sent. That reduced the possible source dramatically. Then came another blow. The aide's access badge was not forged. It had been officially issued months earlier for work at another royal property, and had never been properly deactivated after that assignment ended. William asked the question that moved the investigation forward. Where had the aide gone during the 14 minutes between entering Windsor and appearing inside the meeting? Charles immediately requested the route. The answer would decide whether the stranger had merely wandered through the wrong doors or deliberately searched for something. And suddenly, Charlotte's earlier comment about the side corridor mattered more than ever, before anyone noticed his presence there. 14 minutes. That was the gap investigators could not explain. The aide entered Windsor before the meeting began, yet he did not walk directly toward the chamber, where Charlotte eventually noticed him. Instead, his movements traced a strange path through adjoining corridors. For William, those 14 minutes transformed the episode. A mistaken assignment should have produced confusion. This looked different. Someone who had entered the wrong room would search for help. This man appeared to know exactly where he was going. William studied the reconstructed route with growing anger. Security had pieced it together from internal timestamps, staff recollections, and controlled entry points, meaning each recorded movement could be placed within a narrow window. The path carried the aide past two areas unrelated to the meeting before he moved toward the family. One corridor linked administrative offices with a private section used for confidential royal discussions, making the detour difficult to explain as a simple mistake. William's restraint began to break when officers confirmed that the stranger had spent several minutes outside an area Catherine and the children had passed through earlier. The prince no longer cared about embarrassment or how the incident might look beyond Windsor. This was now about proximity to his family. Catherine listened without interrupting until she asked the question he had been avoiding. Had Charlotte ever been alone there? Security answered no. She closed her eyes briefly, then told William the children had to be kept away from everything that followed. Catherine's fear sharpened the investigation. A staff member gave a documented account, recalling that the aide had asked whether the private discussion had already begun. That phrase mattered because temporary support staff had never been told the gathering was confidential. William immediately understood the implication. The stranger did not simply know there was a meeting. He knew what kind of meeting it was, and someone had given him information he should never have possessed. The aide finally changed his account during a recorded security interview. He admitted that he had entered Windsor after receiving instructions from someone he believed was legitimately connected to the household. He claimed he had been told only to identify where the meeting was taking place and confirm who attended. He insisted he was never instructed to approach Charlotte, Catherine, William, or Charles. That explanation did not calm the prince. It made the breach look organized. William demanded the name behind those instructions. The answer did not expose a royal figure. It pointed instead to someone whose professional connection to Windsor should have ended months earlier. The stranger was no longer the center of the mystery. Now attention shifted to the person outside the palace, who apparently knew enough about Windsor to direct him from a distance. After hours of security briefings, staff interviews, and increasingly uncomfortable discoveries, William finally asked everyone to leave. Only Charles remained. No aides, no advisors, no officials waiting to soften difficult words. For the first time since Charlotte had spotted the stranger, father and son were alone. William did not begin by discussing protocol. He spoke about his daughter. Charles listened, and in that private exchange, the crisis stopped being about a failed system and became about what kind of monarchy they intended to protect. William had already heard the investigators' conclusion. The man directing the uninvited aide was a former contractor whose connection to palace operations should have ended months earlier. A contractor, in simple terms, is an outside professional temporarily hired to perform specific work rather than permanent royal staff. Old administrative links had allowed him to retain fragments of operational knowledge. That alone would not have opened Windsor, but an active badge, familiar internal language, delayed reviews, and staff assuming somebody else had completed the checks had created the opening he needed. William told Charles what had stayed with him most. It was not the false message. It was not the crossed-out name. It was Charlotte looking around a room where she should have felt completely safe and wondering whether an adult belonged there. The prince kept his voice controlled, but he admitted that her uncertainty had affected him more deeply than the breach itself. Charles did not interrupt. The king understood that his son was speaking as a father before speaking as an heir. Charles finally admitted something difficult. When William had raised concerns 3 days earlier, he believed his son was becoming too defensive. The monarch had trusted experience, routine, and established procedures. Now he accepted that the warning had been justified. William did not press the point. That restraint mattered, because this was no longer about proving who had been right. It was about preventing the same failure from happening again. William proposed a new rule. No temporary aide would enter a private family meeting based on one internal message alone. Every substitution would require direct confirmation from 2 separately authorized officials. Charles agreed immediately. He also ordered dormant badges and old contractor permissions, reviewed across every royal residence, turning one frightening moment into lasting reform. Charles paused before leaving and asked William to tell Charlotte something personally. She did exactly what we ask every member of this family to do. She paid attention. The prince understood what those words meant. Father and son had finally reached agreement. But beyond Windsor's walls, the cancelled meeting was already becoming impossible to hide. By the next morning, the silence surrounding Windsor had collapsed. The interrupted meeting, the unfamiliar aide, and Charlotte's unexpected role had become the dominant royal story. Yet what fascinated the public was not simply that security had failed. It was that a young princess had noticed something seasoned adults had missed. For William, that admiration created another dilemma. He wanted the lesson remembered, but he did not want his daughter transformed into the spectacle surrounding it. William read the palace statement carefully before it was released. Palace Communications, meaning the official team responsible for explaining royal events to the public, confirmed that a restricted meeting had been interrupted after an attendance discrepancy was identified, and that security procedures had been tightened. No sensitive operational detail was disclosed. Commentators immediately focused on the prince's decision to stop the meeting, rather than allowing officials to quietly resolve the problem while the discussion continued. William felt increasingly uncomfortable as Charlotte became the center of the story. He told Catherine that their daughter should feel proud for speaking up, but she should never believe that protecting adults was now her responsibility. The Princess of Wales agreed. She understood the danger of turning one brave instinct into a burden. Charlotte felt something different. She was relieved that saying something had mattered, yet embarrassed that strangers were suddenly discussing her judgment as though she had planned to become part of a national drama. Catherine spoke to her daughter quietly and kept the lesson simple. Courage did not mean constantly looking for danger. It meant noticing something that felt wrong and telling someone she trusted. Charlotte understood the difference, and William was relieved to hear it. Still, the public pressure kept growing. Broadcasters began reconstructing how a valid badge had remained active, and how former personnel had retained enough internal knowledge to imitate palace procedures. Outside Windsor Castle, the story became impossible to contain. A small crowd gathered near the Long Walk as television crews broadcast throughout the morning. One newspaper carried a stark front page showing William beside Charlotte, beneath the headline, "She saw him first." The image quickly became the symbol of the crisis. A protective father, and a young princess unexpectedly pulled into a security failure. William knew headlines would fade. What mattered was what came afterward. Public attention had focused on Charlotte, but his final decision would ensure that the lasting result was not a dramatic front page. The crowds would eventually leave, yet one final conversation inside Windsor would decide what his daughter, and the monarchy, carried forward from everything that had happened. The final meaning of the Windsor incident was not found in an access report or security review. It appeared days later, when the family returned to the same room where everything had stopped. The seats were arranged almost exactly as before. The doors were checked. The attendance list had been verified twice, yet Charlotte hesitated for the briefest moment before entering. William noticed. This time, instead of scanning the room himself, he waited beside his daughter and allowed her to decide when she was ready. William had already seen the reforms take effect. Dormant credentials were cancelled, temporary substitutions required approval from 2 authorized officials, old contractor permissions were audited, and restricted meetings received attendance checks before anyone entered. Dual authorization, in simple terms, meant no single internal message could place someone inside a sensitive royal discussion again. The former contractor who directed the aide was removed from palace-linked systems, while the uninvited man lost access after investigators concluded that he had followed improper instructions without verifying them. William still carried one fear. Charlotte's childhood had collided with royal pressure, and the prince feared the experience might leave her suspicious where she deserved to feel safe. Before the next family meeting, she looked toward him and quietly asked, "Everyone here is meant to be here now." He checked the room, answered yes, and watched her nod. Charlotte then took her seat beside Catherine and began speaking naturally again. Since the breach, her father relaxed. Charles entered moments later and addressed his granddaughter directly. The king thanked Charlotte not for catching anyone, but for trusting her instincts and telling her father when something felt wrong. He made one point clear: security belonged to the adults around her. She was not expected to remain watchful every moment. William heard that message too, and so did Catherine. What had begun as fear was finally being turned into reassurance. Charles and William had changed as well. The monarch now accepted that tradition could never become complacency, while his son understood that reform had to be disciplined rather than driven by panic. Their earlier disagreement had not disappeared through victory or defeat. It had been replaced by something more useful: shared responsibility. The Windsor meeting mattered because of what followed. Charlotte exposed the weakness. William stopped the meeting. Charles admitted the failure and corrected it. As the discussion resumed, the prince watched his daughter settle comfortably beside Catherine, while the king looked once toward his son before beginning. No grand declaration was needed. Trust had returned, but this time it rested on stronger rules. Windsor's doors were secure again, yet the deeper protection came from a daughter who spoke, a father who listened, and a king willing to change. The crisis ended with vigilance restored without fear. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.